So at this point, you want to think about how long you want those sprints to be. Do you want to have a month-long sprint or shorter? Remember, it can't be any longer than a month according to Scrum. So a couple of things you might want to consider when determining how long your sprint should be. One would be, how often do you want to have a sprint review to meet with those stakeholders? Is 1 month enough time in between the start of the sprint and meeting those stakeholders, or do you want it to be a little bit sooner? Another one could be, how often do you want the inspection and adaptation opportunities, such as the retrospective and the sprint review and the sprint planning for adaptation? Do you want that to be frequently so that you're going through quicker iterations and quicker cycles with the sprint? And that obviously allows you to be more agile, but also it means that your team are spending a lot of time in sprint events because you're doing them more frequently. However, those sprint events might be shorter because you're doing them more frequently. There's lots of things to think about there, but we're going to stick with the 2 monthly sprint cycles. 2 weekly sprints is a popular choice. Okay, so let's start our sprint on a Tuesday. You might want to start yours on a Monday. It doesn't really matter as long as you have it in and it's consistent. That's the main thing. Everybody knows where it is, when it is, and it fits with the number of weeks that you've decided on your sprint timeframe. So we are going to have our sprint planning on, let's say, 10 o'clock on Tuesday. Now you might want to actually put in the name of the project, just in case people are working on multiple sprints on multiple products. So if you just put sprint planning, for example, they might not know exactly which product that sprint planning is for. So make sure that you put that in the title so there's no confusion. It should be no more than 8 hours for a monthly sprint. We're doing 2 weekly sprints. So you might say that 4 hours would be the right amount of time for sprint planning. Maybe you could do it sooner than that. Let's put it in for 3 hours. Of course, we can always have a reflection on this at the sprint retrospective to find out if that's too much time or too little time and make an adjustment for the next sprint if we need to. Add your guests, right? Sprint planning. Obviously, you're going to need the Scrum team, product owner, Scrum master, and the developers. You might also want to invite some knowledgeable people from the organization that might be able to help with planning. You might want to look at your stakeholder list. I've talked about stakeholders a little bit in the requirements gathering section. So there might be some stakeholders that you want to invite to sprint planning. It's perfectly fine. In fact, a good idea to invite people that can give assistance and help you to plan the next sprint. Location, again, give it a place and a time, and we'll add a description and an agenda. So one thing that you might want to do is go to the Scrum guide and take the information about sprint planning from there. And you could put that in the meeting invite if you wanted, so people understand what sprint planning is about. What is valuable in here is that we've got the topics. So remember, we want to consider in sprint planning why the sprint's valuable, what can be done in the sprint, and how will work get chosen. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put some information into the invite. Okay, I'll just put something simple in here. So, hi, this is the bi-weekly sprint planning event for the BikeX Club website. More information on the purpose of sprint planning is below the agenda. So I've put that there with the Scrum Guide's definition and purpose of sprint planning. So everybody's got that and can understand what sprint planning is about. The agenda itself, obviously, we'll start with introductions, finish with any other business. And one of the main things to do first is decide on the sprint goal. With the sprint goal in mind, then you can have a look at the product backlog and you can then decide on the items that you want for the sprint backlog. Remember, the sprint backlog is the plan for the developers and by the developers to be able to reach and meet the sprint goal. Then you're going to begin the sprint, and that's your sprint planning session. One of the key things to do in the sprint planning session, of course, is to consider the capacity of the development team. Now, the developers, some of them might be on leave, some of them might be unwell. There might be other things that reduces their capacity this sprint. So one of the first things you need to do is determine how much development time you've got in this sprint. And then when you've sized the different independent tickets up, you know how much you can tackle in this sprint. And then that determines how many sprint items you put into the sprint backlog. In practice, it's actually very difficult to do this because work estimation is always hard. But at least if you know how many people you've got for this sprint and how much of their time you've got, then you can make some reasonable assessments on how much work you can pull into the sprint. So that's quite important, of course. Okay, we'll save that. One thing we still need to do actually is to make this a reoccurring meeting. So it obviously needs to reoccur every 2 weeks. You might want to set an end as well, otherwise it'll just fill up people's calendars. So think about how long you have determined it's going to take to build this product by looking at your product roadmap. So let's say that for us, it's going to end on April. That sounds about right. So we've got a few months to actually build this website and finish it by the start of next financial year. And then if you actually jump ahead to the other weeks, you can see that they've been replicated. Right, so that's sprint planning. Now, let's get some daily scrums in the calendar so that we can meet every single day and do our daily scrums.